Presenters today are Norm David Bailey and David Ang. So I will hand off the mic to you, David. Have a good conference, everybody.
Great, thank you, Cassandra. Good morning, everyone, and glad to be with you and giving us the opportunity to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Hopefully you're on the right presentation. Norm, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So this is who we are. Norm, do you want to introduce yourself in 30 seconds or less, and then I'll do the same?
Sure, I won't even take 30 seconds. Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Norm Bailie-David, for those of you who don't know me. David and I have been working in the field of employee engagement for the better part of on and off for the better part of, well, we've been working together for 25 years, plus, actually more than 30.
27 years.
27 and counting, you see that.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a long history in this particular area. And especially in the last 10 years or so, we've really focused on employee engagement, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'll hand it back to Dave. You introduce yourself and keep going.
Yeah, thanks, Norm. So as Norm mentioned, 27 years we've been working together. That's actually when I started my career back in 1994, April. So, you know, I look young, but I'm not young. And we'll get to that later on. Anyways, a lot of experience in this area, as well as management consulting and research. My background, I've worked with very large companies, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Cantor TNS, as well as boutique firms, as well as obviously, you know, boutique firm that Norm and I run today. So
just a note of thanks before you keep going to EPSI for giving us this opportunity to speak to you folks today. So,
yes, thank you very much. Let's go to the agenda slide, Norm. So what we're going to talk about, diversity and inclusion, obviously. Really, our presentation is, there's three main buckets that we're going to be speaking to. So we're going to start with some background and history on D&I, and I think that's important so that we have a baseline understanding of, you know, what it is we're actually talking about when we talk DE&I. And then we're going to talk about the relationship between DE&I and employee engagement. And finally, the last component of the presentation will focus on, what do we do with this? How can organizations actually put into effect policies that work for them and work for their employees? Next, Norm. So let's start with diversity and inclusion. So it's a very topical piece right now. It's in the news. It's the forefront. You know, Black Lives Matter has really elevated the discussion around you know, DE&I, racism. You know, in Canada, the whole sexual harassment issues at the Department of National Defense, I think, is another example of why this is important. So what is diversity? I think it's important to acknowledge that it's beyond just the workplace. We're focused on the workplace discussion here, but really diversity is the representation of different groups in broader society. In our context today, it's in the workplace. So what does that include? So historically, in the workplace, I believe the initial push was with women in the workplace, coming into the workforce, taking their rightful place in, you know, in organizations, and then that expanded to ethnic and racial diversity in the workplace. But in recent years, especially the last, I would say, 10 years or so, that discussion has broadened quite significantly to include various other groups, from sexual preference, age, religion, linguistically. In Canada has a longer history, obviously. So it's really any group that needs to be represented in the workplace because they are represented in society at large. So that's what diversity is. It's that representation of groups. If we look at inclusion, it's a little bit different. So you can have a diverse society and a diverse workplace, but it might not be an inclusive workplace or an inclusive society. So what do we mean by inclusion? Inclusion refers to ultimately the experience of people in society, or from a workplace perspective, employees in the organization. It's the experience that they have, the culture of the organization. It's the feeling of being accepted, being valued, that you can be your true self, you can be your authentic self. You don't have to come in and put on a facade when you're in the workplace to quote unquote fit in. You're encouraged to share, your opinions count, you can contribute. You feel like you're a valuable member of society, you're a valuable member of the organization. The analogy I heard, which I think is really good, is diversity is like getting an invitation to the party. Inclusion is being asked to actually dance at the party. So you can be, if you can be diverse without being inclusive. So why is all of this important? It's nice in theory. Well, it's important because positive DE&I actually have very profound impacts on businesses. So organizations that get this right have more engaged and employees who feel more empowered. And there's a lot of research, many of you have done surveys on this, and certainly there's a very strong correlation between DE&I and employee engagement and empowerment. So if employees are more engaged and more empowered, they tend to be more productive. If they're more productive, ultimately what happens? The organization is more profitable, and let's not kid ourselves. While a lot of this is nice to do, for a lot of organizations, profitability is what's driving pretty much everything. So that's important. From an externality perspective, it's very positive on the brand. Companies, especially big organizations that are seen to be doing the right thing and are promoting equity and inclusion and have a diverse workforce, have very good brand metrics. Let's go to the next slide, Nora. So now that we understand what diversity and inclusion is, let's have a quick look at the history of DE&I and how that has impacted the workplace. And I think a good place to start is in Canada. Let's go to the next slide. So the Canadian experience is built on multiculturalism. I think we're probably all familiar with multiculturalism. The Canadian mosaic, it was taught in school. Very different from the US approach, which is the melting pot, which Norm will talk about in a few minutes. So multiculturalism refers to having a welcoming society in terms of different types of people, ethnicities, cultures, religion, language, setting it up in a way that people feel proud of their differences, of their diversity, and they're encouraged, to share this. That's what multiculturalism is. It's part of the fabric of Canadian society. It's certainly highly emphasized here. It's based on an ideology, but very, very importantly, it's not just an ideology or a thought. It's supported by government policy, which entrenches this in Canadian society. And in fact, Canada was the first country in the world that passed a multiculturalism law in 1988. So, we're putting actions behind the ideology. This, though, is sometimes we're in a good space in terms of multiculturalism. I don't want to downplay that, but I think we have a bit of a superiority complex, especially vis-a-vis the Americans. We think we're more multicultural. We're better than the experiences in the US, and to some extent we are. But, and there's always a but, doesn't mean that inequality, divisiveness, racism doesn't exist here in Canada. Before I pass it to Norm, I'll just share with you some personal experiences around this. You can see from my picture that I'm a minority. I'm actually biracial, two different ethnic groups. And I was born in Canada. I went to school in Canada. I've worked here, but I've also traveled and lived in other places in the world. And my Canadian experience is very positive by and large. And it's not, I don't want to overplay the situation here, but there are things that annoy me and annoy many people like me. What I'll term microaggressive behaviors and stereotypes. These are the two most common things I think that minorities like myself face. For example, question I get all the time: where were you born? You know, which to me is a crazy question. So when I tell them I was born in tell these people I'm born in Kitchener, Ontario, the next question is, oh, okay, so where were your parents born? Kind of a ridiculous question if you ask me. Another, you know, very standard question I get is, well, we're surprised you speak such good English. And why wouldn't I? You know, I went to school here and I've spoken English my whole life. Is David my real name, or is it my quote unquote Canadian name? I mean, what kind of questions are these? You know, I don't think people who ask these questions necessarily mean to be offensive, or, you know, they may not even be thinking that there's anything wrong with it, but it hits to that idea of inclusivity. I don't, you know, it takes away from the inclusiveness when people are questioning if I'm Canadian because of questions like this. I don't think I've ever heard a white Canadian being asked this question. I mean, if they have, I'd be very surprised. And finally, again, I want to emphasize, though, that Canada is in a very good spot, relatively speaking. It doesn't mean that there's not more to improve upon in terms of equity and inclusiveness, but we are on the right path. And vis-a-vis other countries, for example, I lived in Malaysia as a teenager, and there's actual government policy that discriminates against the smaller minority groups. Things like, for example, favorable interest rates at banks for the majority group, inability of minority groups to get public sector jobs. I mean, and this is built into government policy. So I'm going to pass it to Norm to talk about the Quebec experience, Norm being a Quebecer, and the American experience. But keep in mind that Canada is actually in a pretty good spot, with the caveat that there is still a lot of work to do. So, you know.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So I turned off those bright lights for you. I hope, I'm sure some of you looked away by now. Didn't quite expect to have that slide up there for that long. When we talk about multiculturalism, there's a couple of points we want to make here. So multiculturalism was really brought in by the Pierre Elliott Trudeau government, as you know. But the concept has been expanded in our culture and society to be more inclusive of the other diverse groups. So at first it was ethnic based, but now the same principles are applying to the other minorities, LGBTQ+, self-declared disabled, etc. But at the same time, we can't say that this is equal or homogeneous across Canada. And whether you're in the West or in Quebec or in the Maritimes or in the Atlantic or in the North, the views towards this and how that manifests itself in terms of diversity and inclusion, and by extension in organizations, is very different. The slide you're seeing here really is used to demonstrate just the difference when we look at Quebec versus the rest of Canada. I grew up in Quebec. I experienced, as an Anglophone, many of the same microaggressions that David experienced in Canada and other parts of the world. I won't go into detail, we'll just move on, we've made our point. But we can't assume that the Quebec experience, the Western experience, is saying multiculturalism is interpreted very differently across the different parts of the country. Dave mentioned before the American experience. We would be remiss if we try to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace in Canada if we don't talk very briefly about the American experience. Why? Because of relativism. Because the Canadian experience is such that we compare ourselves on everything to our neighbors to the south. And because the American experience on diversity, equity, and inclusion is so different, then, as David said, we have sort of a smugness or a superiority complex built in. And how that manifests itself in organizations is a lot of denial. A lot of denial in terms of systemic racism. Does it exist? Oh, no, we're not racist here. We're not as bad as the US, so it goes. And so the approach has been very, very different. I'm not going to go into detail. If Canada is a multicultural and variant experience. So the racism that's taken hold, the anti-ableism, if you want, heterosexualism, if you wish, all of that is really compared to what's going on in the States. And in the US, as you see, it's a very recent experience, but it's all premised on the concept of the melting pot. Culturally speaking, what that means is in the American experience, there is an expectation to integrate, to assimilate. Yes, by and large, with the exception maybe of the last 4 or 5 years in the United States, it's been a very welcoming country to most type of diversity groups. However, there is an experience that you are basically expected to integrate, to put your diversity aside and meld with the majority. And that is what separates the US and Canada. And of course, we would expect, I'm going to say, in terms of anti-Black racism, we would think, oh, wow, we didn't have slavery in Canada. Oh, yes, we did. One interesting factoid is you might not realize is we had more slaves that were of Indigenous origin than Black origin, but slavery in Canada was alive and well up till the 1820s or so, roughly speaking. And so much of that history is common, but we tend to forget about it because the American experience is so strong with it. And we move to 2020. 2020 is a watershed in this entire space. And you know where I'm leading with this. But when you think about the Canadian experience, how many of you remember before George Floyd, everything that was going on with the Indigenous groups? Do you remember the rail blockade near Cornwall? Do you remember the Wet'suwet'en, the pipeline fight up in northern BC? Do you remember the issue with the Mi'kmaq and the lobster fishery? Do you remember even the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's Report? Those have sort of faded into the background. Many of us, yeah, okay, we might remember now that I put it back on the slide, but it really did not take hold in the Canadian public consciousness, and certainly didn't take hold as an impetus for organizational and transformational change. And then came George Floyd. And George Floyd has changed everything. Why? It's part of the American experience, or is it? It's equally part of the Canadian experience. I'll show you, and because of the power of social media, and of course, this week, this topic is very apropos with the verdict coming down on Derek Chauvin, the individual, the police person who put his knee on George Floyd's neck. For those of you who might not have remembered, I'm sure everybody does. So what's happened? Why now? And how has this changed the landscape? For organizations, this is where, up to now, you might have noticed that David and I have been using the terms D&I and DEI almost interchangeably. In fact, that's a little bit of a mistake because up until George Floyd, the term we used was diversity and inclusion. And yet after George Floyd, now the term has become diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why? And why has this taken hold in Canadian organizations? Well, simply because it's taken a hold in the public consciousness. And you look at some of the statistics on the screen, the support for Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter, by the way, is not just an American phenomenon, and as I'll show you on the next slide. It's equally a Canadian phenomenon, and some would even argue a global phenomenon. And it's because of that support, the white support that has emerged in the last 6 months, 6 to 8 months. Of course, most corporate Canada, corporate America is very sensitive to that. And that's what is driving the transformational change. I don't mean to put a cynical spin on it. But certainly, I mean, and organizations have stepped up in a number of ways. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But really, that transformational change has taken hold because of the social media exposure to George Floyd. And now that consciousness is equally true in Canada. and you just have to look at the screen and some of the images. Those are all images of Black Lives Matter anti-racism protests in Canada, in Ottawa, in Vancouver, in Montreal, across the country. It has taken hold here too. And it's somewhat unfortunate because the Canadian experience has really not, I mean, the anti-Indigenous racism has always been there. You know, the ableism has always been there. The homophobia has always been there. But it's taken this particular event to bring it into the organizations and the corporate consciousness. And in effect, we can say that's partially a good thing, because you're sitting here and you're listening to this presentation, which means you're taking an interest in it for your organizations as well. I want to turn the page a little bit, literally, and bring this much more to an organizational or a corporate context. And D&I and employee engagement, D&I, DEI and employee engagement. What's the link here? And how do, you know, what is it? How do we move forward with it? Well, there's a link essentially in two ways. The first, you're looking at a chart that's a very common chart that EPSI produces and we interpret for most organizations, almost all organizations that do employee engagement surveys with us. And what this shows is on two axes, the different themes that influence employee engagement in terms of their relative impact. So from left to right, that theme has a lesser importance, such as compensation doesn't have a big impact on employee engagement, and professional growth, innovation, and as I'm going to talk about, diversity and inclusion certainly does, has the highest impact in organizations, and everything else in between. And of course, from top to bottom is how employees view these different themes, whether they're favorable on top, less favorable on the bottom. All to say that when we started measuring diversity and inclusion in organizations roughly about 5 or 6 years ago, I think my first survey that included D&I was about 2013, 2014, so a little bit longer than that. Basically, what happened, and muchly, I have to admit, much to my surprise, I figured diversity and inclusion would be up here somewhere. Very, very well viewed, but not very important in terms of driving that link, that feeling of engagement that drives discretionary effort in organizations. But we were proved wrong again and again and again and again and again. Diversity and inclusion, not only is it viewed by a majority of employees favorably in the organization, but it has an impact, a big impact on that sense of engagement. And I'm going to explain why that impact exists in a few slides from now, but it is important. So when we measure diversity and inclusion, the questions that we use, I mean, these can be customized to any organization, but we're basically getting at the two concepts that David introduced on the first slide: the representativeness, so the aspects of diversity, and the aspect of acceptance, inclusion, openness, etc., and leadership. Overall, when we look at all organizations in the EPSI benchmark, almost 80% view these 5 traits in their organization favorably. And that's a good thing, you would think, right? So basically what I'm going to, before I answer that question, we're going to do a little bit of poll. I'm going to get you involved in this a little bit. All right, so now you see here, what I want you to do is I want you to go to this address here, menti.com. I'm going to put it in the chat. And either do it on your phone, or if you've got a second screen on your computer, if you're watching on 2 screens, do it there. So menti.com. And you type in, when you get there, you type in the code that's on the top of your screen. So 82125462, or thank you, Cass, better typist than I am. And so answer that question. Which of these groups would you say feels the least included and is also the least engaged? It's not a double-barrel question for those of you who know survey research. The answer is the same for both. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds or so to answer that question. So we got 60 seconds. Okay, it doesn't look like my screen is moving all that much more. So won't just waste time waiting. Let's close the voting here. There you go. Look at that. The answer, the correct answer, is those with a disability. And I can see I've surprised a lot of people by that. Indigenous peoples is probably a close second, but in survey after survey after survey, it's those with a disability that really feel the least included and feel the least engaged as a result. So very interesting tidbit, interesting result. And it goes to show that even though our minds, because of the media attention, are super hyper focused on racism, the visible minority, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism as well, more recently, it's actually those who have declared a disability in your organizations that are probably feeling the least included. And so we need to keep that into account, and when we're taking the big picture into account. So what I want to do now here is sort of shift a little bit and show you the organizations where we feel we are on a continuum that was established by this group here at the top, the BCW group, an Australian group, and you can see where that is here. And what I'm going to do here is I want you to look, I'll show you this again. So there's 5 big categories. Those of you who are unaware, those of you who are compliant, and in the US experience, has been up till probably the last 10 years or so, largely based on compliance with employee equity legislation, et cetera, et cetera. Those of you who now feel, okay, we get it, it's important to our success. Is it integrated in everything we do? Do we look at everything we do through a D&I lens? And are we leaders, our best practice? So I'm going to ask you now, I'm going to put our Mentimeter back on here. And I'm going to get to the next question. Where does your organization fit in that the D&I maturity model? Where would you say you are? Are you unaware, compliant, strategic, integrated, or disruptive? I know there's more of you out there, so come on, let's get those votes in. It's all anonymous. We won't care if somebody's unaware. No judgment here. This is a very inclusive presentation. Okay, so I don't see any more movement. Let's close it up here. And no right answer, except I'm going to turn it over to Dave, who's going to basically take us through some of the material behind this. So Dave, go ahead.
Thanks, Norm. So if we look at the maturity model here, what we can see is most organizations feel that they're at the integrated level, when in reality, most are somewhere in the compliant strategic area. So there's a bit of a gap between perception and reality. And the question is why? Why is there that gap? And really, there's a couple of reasons that I think that we can hone in on. One revolves around leadership. So leadership perhaps hasn't fully bought into the idea of D&I. They acknowledge that it's an issue, that there are things that need to be done, but their approach to it is to enact policy or programs, things like surveys or ensuring that minority groups are hired to some extent. And once that's done, it's we've achieved what we need to achieve. So we're there. What it doesn't address necessarily is that cultural aspect, the inclusivity part of the equation, and Norm will talk to some of these details in terms of the numbers from surveys in a couple of minutes. If we go to the next slide, I think it might be quite revealing, because when you look at D&I by age or by generation, there's actually the research shows that there's actually quite a difference of opinion in terms of how this is viewed. And part of that, I would hypothesize, is driving where organizations are at. So if we look at the older generations, the boomers and the Gen Xers, so the boomers being those born between 46 and 63. So you know who you are. I'm a Gen Xer.
I'm a boomer.
There we go. So Norm and I have this group covered. So what's the boomer Gen X view of D&I? It's really what Deloitte calls a moral and legal imperative. So we view D&I, and when I read this, I actually totally related to this. So when I think of diversity and inclusion, I think of representation based on identifiable demographic characteristics. And we talked about that earlier. Ethnicity, gender, age, so on and so forth. We think it's the right thing to do, that there should be representation, and we set up programs within our organizations to accomplish this. And guess who's in charge of most organizations right now and in the recent past? It will be people of the boomer generation and the Gen X generation primarily that are running organizations. So it's not surprising that the programs and policies established in organizations reflect this thinking. If we go to millennials and Gen Z, so millennials would be anyone born 1980 to 95, and Gen Z are people my kids' age, 96 and onwards. Their view of D&I is quite different. They take the boomer Gen X view as a given. Why are we even discussing this? Of course, representation is important. Of course, having the framework is important. But true D&I is really built around the I. It's around what we call cognitive diversity. It's feeling that my opinions, my views are respected and count. And it allows me to connect with people, to collaborate with my colleagues, and to achieve my goals professionally, but also for the business. So it's much more around the personal experiences and ability to contribute than the older generation's view, which is around that moral and legal imperative. There's some interesting data from this Deloitte study. Norm, if you put that up, and it very visibly shows some differences of opinion, what millennials and non-millennials view as important. And you can see, I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but you can see that the value system is different in terms of D&I. Let's go to the next slide, Norm.
Okay. So remember I said a few slides ago that, it looks okay. 78% overall, that's an average, of all organizations that we've surveyed in the past. Basically, and that's from a benchmark of hundreds of thousands of organizations, so it's a combined benchmark. D&I is positively perceived. DEI is positively perceived. So what impact does that have on organizations? And it's partly the answer to the question, of why there is that disconnect in the maturity model that Dave was talking about. So here's a typical slide, and the overall average is 78. The benchmark goes back a couple of years. It's now probably, as we update the benchmark, it's going to start to increase because awareness of D&I, DEI is increasing. So this is a very recent survey of one of our clients. And it's very typical as well. So when you look at this, and when I present this to senior leadership, I'm going to bring you into the boardroom and paint a picture for you here. So I present this to senior leadership, and as you can see, you know, COVID-19 was on the survey, so it's very recent. And we saw the questions around inclusion, respect, and diversity, and 81% of their employees said that's favorable. So what do you think the reaction was by the board members and the people around the table? Has like, wow, our scores are over 80%. We're good. We don't have an issue here. Let's focus on the stuff down at the bottom. That's how senior leadership reacts, and typically reacts. So when we do survey after survey after survey, you can start to understand why that senior leadership believes their organization is doing so well, because survey results get interpreted in terms of majorities, in terms of big numbers, right? We have got 81% favorable. We don't have to worry about the they're just exceptions. They're one-offs, they're bad apples, whatever. We don't have to worry about that too much. We don't have to, but what about the 19%? How are they feeling? And this comes to the example, the reason why employee engagement and inclusion, respect, and diversity, or DEI, are so intertwined is because this 19%, roughly 20% in pretty much every organization that we survey, those same people are the same people that are less than engaged. And because of they are less than engaged, and they have lower scores here, that correlation means that that's going to have an impact. Ergo, some things that are down here, like information and communication, have less impact. More people are upset about it, but it has less impact overall in terms of engagement. But as we address the 20%, we're going to have a bigger impact on engagement. And so that's why it's really important to understand the impact of surveys. So when there's an employee issue, right? And I've been called in to assist many of my clients. What do you think? What do most organizations do when we think we have an issue? We do a survey. Hey, yeah, time to do a survey. Let's figure out how bad is this problem, and it goes beyond DEI. When we have issues around discrimination and harassment, which are extensions, the extremes of the lack of inclusion, yeah, we're going to need to do a survey. I get calls weekly from clients saying, what do I do about this? I think we need to do a survey. But if you're listening carefully, you understand that, you know what, that it might be a good idea, but they're not helping yet. Most surveys are actually reinforcing a lack of action. What? Excuse me? I'm talking from companies, ourselves at Entegritē and EPSI, we do surveys. Why would I say not do a survey? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is when we do the typical survey and ask the typical questions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, what it's going to do if we're not careful in its interpretation, it validates leaders' confidence in the status quo. 81% favorable, folks. We don't need to do anything. We don't have a big problem. And because of that, that's rendering the issue of the 19%, it's entrenching it even more. It's rendering that institutional racism, ableism, heterosexism, it becomes even more intractable because our leaders believe we don't have a problem. And compound that with our relativism when we look at the US experience and we say, we really don't have a problem. Look at their problem down there, right? It's not that bad up here. Yeah, we got some bad apples. So the solution here is, yeah, I'm not saying, please, I'm not saying don't measure. We need to measure. What gets measured gets managed. Do the survey. But when you do the survey and you ask those questions, anticipate that you're going to have the large majority of your employees are going to feel fine. Part of the reason is the large majority of your employees are part of the majority. Increasingly, what we're seeing is there's more of the majority that are less than satisfied, and that's a good thing. But overall, you're going to see roughly 80% of your organization, unless you got real big issues, you're going to see 80% of your organization favorable. Does that mean we do not act? No, we certainly must act on the 20%. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Dave, and we're going to tell you how are organizations responding now? What are we doing? What are they doing? And I'll come back and close in terms of giving you some strategic thrusts, some things that you need to do, but also some things that you should be wary about. So take it away, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Norm. So in the interest of time, I'll kind of speed through this. So Norm talked about surveys. I think we've all done them over many years, and they are a key component to measure where things are at. But organizations in the recent past and maybe not so recent past have been doing some other things as well to address DE&I. So what are they? So public statements. It's very important, especially in today's day and age with social media and everything else that's amplifying messages, for companies and organizations to come out and publicly state where they stand on different issues. I think a great example was recently happened in the US when major companies like Coke and Google very publicly came out in opposition of restrictive voting rights in Georgia. Major League Baseball even went further and pulled their All-Star game out of Atlanta in protest of the restrictive action. So public statements are very, very important. It sends a signal to their employees and to their clients and to the world on where they stand on these types of issues. Donations to nonprofits, specifically nonprofits that are focused on addressing inequity and so on. Putting your money where your mouth is. It's not just all talk. That's very important. And then from an internal perspective, what can be done by organizations? We've seen a big push towards diversity training, bias training, internal actions that will help employees, managers, and even leadership, and there's leadership training around this to address issues around DE&I. So that's what organizations are doing. But what do employees themselves want, especially those employees that fall into the diversity category? So this study by BCG, I think, is quite revealing, and they looked at 4 different groups: women, LGBTQ plus, people of color, and Indigenous, separated out from people of color, and asked, what do you as a group want us as an organization to do? And we can see from the top line, there's consensus that anti-discrimination policies are what's most important. And that goes back, if you think to the maturity model, setting up the right programs and policies so that legalistically, the organization is bound to do these things. But when you look below that top line, I think the key message is there's no one size fits all in terms of what different groups are looking for in terms of actions and programs from their employers. So for women, it's parental leave is very important. Whereas for people of color and Indigenous, diversity training is more important. So I think the takeaway here is, as an organization, having a homogenous single policy around DE&I may not be the right thing to do. I think you need to take into account what your employee base is and build programs around what works for them. And this is where surveys are important as well, or consultations with employees in your own organization to see what is important to them. That being said, I think there is definitely some common elements that feed into good DEI strategy overall, outside of the customization that we're looking at here. And I'll pass it back to Norm to talk about what are the foundational things that need to go into that strategy.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so I'll speed through this, but I assume you're going to have access to this presentation afterwards. So there's a lot of notes and a lot of body to it. But the key here, I think I'm going to flip back a couple of slides, is the reaction of most organizations to DEI is, oh, well, we need to do training. The bigger ones are doing the public statements and invest in not-for-profits, and I'll be cynical and say that's more, a lot of that's for show. But a lot of them are going to, okay, our strategy is going to hinge on training, and so we have to be careful that that is not a panacea, and training in and of itself should be part of a multifaceted strategy. And the most important thing, that strategy has to be both top down, so that's leadership and policy, and bottom up. So the most important thing by far is leadership and acknowledgement, public acknowledgement that structural inequities do exist. Systemic racism, systemic ableism, systemic homophobia, etc. And I'm not going to go into definitions of systemic, what that means, but unless and until leadership acknowledges that there's an issue in the organization, and there is, right? That's fact. Nothing's going to happen. You can do all the training you want in the world, it's not going to change the culture and the values of the organization. Leadership has to set an example. They have to articulate values. They have to actually transform culture around the 20%. Policies, particularly around hiring and promotion. And those policies, I'm going to make a differentiation in a few seconds around the difference between, treating everybody equal and, making sure that we enact policies that recognize the systemic nature of the lack of inclusiveness. Yes, some investment is required. Social impact funds, corporate social responsibility that addresses inclusiveness. And what we're seeing very lately is marketing to diverse groups, whereas marketers tend to market to the 80%. We need to be much more inclusive in our marketing and our promotion to include the different minority groups. Advertising agencies in the last 6 months, if you're watching TV and you're seeing commercials, you're seeing that start to happen. Very good example is locating markets and supermarkets in areas which are populated by minorities of different types. Those are the types of things we're talking about, but that's not enough. We also need to do the bottom up. The training in and of itself is not going to be enough, and it actually can do more harm than good. If our training consists of bringing in members of diverse groups and asking them to educate us. There's enough information out there that we can educate ourselves first and then engage the diverse groups and have a conversation. We need to learn the language of DEI. We need to learn about microaggression and how it happens and what we do, and David's example from before, and I have examples I could share offline. Code switching, making people feel that they've got to change themselves to fit in, and be different people to fit in. That's a very stressful thing. And so we need to be cognizant of that. Be allies, create an allyship culture. I've got a lot of references in here. We're going to close out in a second or two. But just to wrap, our experience is different, but it's not better. It's not better. Don't make that, don't let your leaders say that we don't have a problem here. There's not systemic issues here. There is. It is. Research shows there is. And even if 80% of your organizations are going to be favorable, we need to listen to the 20%. And it's not just a moral imperative, it's a business imperative. And the business case is very, very clear for all to see. And finally, training is not the solution by itself. It takes a multifaceted strategy. And those of you that are putting together that strategy, don't hinge it just on the training. Make sure that it's got all of those components in it. And I'll finish on this one slide here. Up to now, we basically say, okay, we're going to treat everybody equal. Well, if we treat everybody equal and there's systematic inequities that are built in hiring and promotion and inclusiveness, then you're going to have something that resembles the left. We need to do something that resembles the right. So like I said, there's a lot of references here. I'm going to close out there. I don't know, Cass, if we've taken up too much time. If there's any questions up there, I'll close it now, and we'll see if we have a minute or two for questions.
Thanks, Norm. Thanks, David. We are running out of time. There is one question that was sent in the chat. It says, hi, Dave and Norm. Do you break out the data by race, gender, ability, age when measuring DEI and employee engagement?
Dave, I'll take that. Very quick answer to that. We would like to, but in Canada especially, it has not been common practice to measure those things. And one of the things and part of a strategy is we need to include now minority-based data. Whereas before, we shied away from doing that. And in a survey in the US, you would typically be asked what ethnic group